So I've now started recording. There is a chat box to the side which you can use for questions or comments as we go through. The agenda for today's meeting is Jane from Oxfordshire Community Foundation is going to be presenting on the Resilience Fund that is being launched at the moment, that is launching now. We have Nick Mott from the Charity Commission is going to talk a bit about some of the advice that's available for charities and the support available in light of the COVID response. Richard Kennell from Sophia will be talking about, from a local charities perspective, about the COVID response, and there will be time for Q&A at the end as well. But do start posting comments or messages in the box. If we don't have time for everything, we will, continue the communications after this meeting, and we hope to make this a weekly session every Wednesday afternoon. So without further ado, I will hand over to Jane, who I think is going to share her screen for the presentation.
I most certainly am. So we're just going to obviously start by saying a very, very big thank you to all of you who've joined us. I know that we've got people represented from the councils, county, some funders, and obviously, very importantly, charity sector leaders. And I want you to know that we really do thank you for everything that you're doing at the moment. We know that you're working in really challenging circumstances, and that you're having to respond in a very agile way to some needs that we're only realizing what those might be. So I just want to sort of personally say that we hear your pain, and we know that everyone's desperate for information. There's lots of news being spread around and very little clarity. So hopefully the idea of these webinars is that we can just provide a little bit more around that, because often a little information is not very helpful. So just really from me, very big thank you. Also, before we kick into what we're trying to do with the fund, wanted just to say that we're probably up to about £650,000. So it's a large pot of money, and one that we hope to be able to grow on behalf of the sector. Obviously, it behoves us that we we need to distribute that in a very sensible way. So hopefully everything that you hear today will prove that we have thought about it in the short time that we've had to do that. But and we will be making some of our first grants before the end of this week, which we hope will total around 25,000. So we are trying to be really responsive. I think the slide that you've got up at the moment is just giving you two sort of ideas around how we anticipate the money to be distributed from the fund. And whilst the word phase is used, I'd see these as being two particular strands. At the moment, there is a huge effort on emergency relief, and it's absolutely critical that we understand what those unanticipated needs are.
Jane, sorry,
yes?
I think you're sharing your video, not your screen.
Oh dear. Okay, so let's go back into that. Let me try that. Back into Zoom. Right.
Just to say, we've now got 100 people on this call, so
shall I thank everyone again then? Shall I thank everyone again? Right, so is that the screen that you can see now?
No.
Okay. Right, I know, that's good. Okay, right.
Yes.
So back to the screen. Right. So my apologies, it did work earlier for us. Yeah, so thank you to those who have just joined. What we're just starting on was obviously the Community Foundation's Resilience Fund for Oxfordshire, and our objectives for how we hope to do distributing the money. We're looking at it very much in two phases. There's going to be obviously emerging needs that are coming out of the current pandemic. And our priority at this stage is to really listen and understand what those needs are, and to release funds quickly to the organisations delivering that relief. But alongside that, the value of the charitable sector is obviously something that we hold close to our heart, and we really want to make sure that the essential services that many of the charities and all of you that are working in the charities can actually continue to deliver those services long before and during the crisis once it's all over. So obviously we need to continue listening, but actually working more detailed on those. So in terms of the priority areas that we're looking at for phase one, I think it won't come as any surprise that we understand that food distribution is what most people's big challenge, and in particular how to find advice on support where most of how you can actually access that, in particular looking at beneficiary groups that will include the elderly, the homeless, and those at risk of becoming homeless at this challenging time, but also children at risk. We're very aware that the whole homeschooling environment and the need to self-isolate is very difficult for some children and families in particular. Also those with medical conditions where the virus is actually imposing additional restrictions for people to be self-isolating, which is making it very difficult for people to go about their daily business. And also those who have lost their income. We are anticipating this to be quite a challenge for a number of individuals and families. And I know that whilst there is government support on this, again, it's down to clarity. You're having to wait for information on that. So that's one of our sort of key things. We're also very keen to work ever more closely with some of the larger organisations that can help us actually understand those needs and have the ability to deliver at scale, possibly through others in places where they're building better partnerships with other charities around the county. But in particular, sort of cooperatives and collaborative structures like the Oxford Homeless Movement is a good example. We believe these all have a key part to play in helping us understand where resources can be shared and deployed effectively, but also developing solutions that are really needed right now. So the next phase that we talked about was, and this is really important because we know that many charities are sort of feeling very, very exposed due to the loss of income. Some of you will have trading parts to your organisation, and obviously that isn't able to continue at the moment. So we want to understand how we might be able to work together to look at any short-term cash flow problems that have come about from the crisis. And one real important way to be doing that is actually to bring together many of the other partners that we always work with, but also other people who might be able to add their expertise, finance and support, mentoring. I think in something we sent out earlier this week, we were talking about charity mentors. These are all really great ways that we can come together and collaborate over this. So on to the application process, which is now launched. All the details are on our website and we can send links afterwards. But the key thing here is there will be just one very simple application form. It's very quick. It's not going to be onerous. We really promise that. We've stripped out every unnecessary question. What is really important though is everything is accessible. The OCF team are all available and happy to answer any questions or even to help in taking details for applications. Another thing that we've really tried to relax is our eligibility, and all our terms and conditions have been relaxed for this purpose, especially as we're looking at phase one, which is all about emerging and urgent relief. So things like income thresholds, previous monitoring, organisation history, all of those things are going to be relaxed. And I think this is the bit that's perhaps the biggest change, is that we've really understood your pain and the need for money to reach organisations right at the moment. So we're going to be running a rolling process for decision making, and we have pledged to make weekly grant payments so that we can actually distribute money very, very quickly. And on that, I said we will be doing £25,000 this week. So I think I might leave it there at the moment, and just, yeah,
Thank you, Jane.
we can move on.
There will be time for questions and answers later. I'm going to move on now, though, to Nick Mott from the Charity Commission, who's generously agreed to give us some time and brief us on what the Charity Commission are doing and what support they're able to provide. I'm going to put a link in the chat box, which provides more information for those who want to have a look at that. But I'll hand over to Nick now.
Great, thank you very much, Neil and Jane, and thank you for the opportunity to join this meeting. It's so important for us to check in and listen to how the sector is coping, responding, and what the issues are that you're facing. My role with the Charity Commission is primarily about the trustee guidance on our website, and we've been responding to a lot of the immediate questions that many charities have had. And I think you just wanted me to come along, to give a perspective from the Charity Commission on what we're seeing generally, also how we're positioning ourselves from a regulatory point of view, and what help we're giving. Of course, we're seeing a lot of charities on the front line at the moment, and the current crisis pandemic is an extreme test of charities' resourcefulness and resilience, and what we're seeing today is a good example of how charities are responding vigorously to the challenges that you're facing. But yes, we can see really high demand for services and vanishing income, with some really quite scary stories about high reductions in the amount of fundraising income because of loss of activity, loss of ability to appeal, loss of shop income, investment income going down, and so on. So obviously for a lot of charities, the immediate interest is about financial survival, how you can reshape your activities and your approach, where you can get new sources of funding from. And as the charity regulator, I'm sorry to say that we're not a source of funding. And if we're not a source of funding, how can we help? Well, I think we know that we can help because of some of the, because of the demand for our services. We're seeing the sorts of questions that are coming through, and also the regulatory framework we know does matter to charities and to public confidence in charities, which is particularly important at this time. But we're very clear that the charity regulatory framework must add value, and absolutely it must not get in the way of all charities' efforts to do what they do best, which is about providing services, helping their beneficiaries. So we've made clear in guidance on our website that we're taking a flexible and pragmatic approach where we can. We're prioritising casework that is specifically to do with the COVID-19 pandemic. We have put up some guidance pages on our website in response to some common questions, and we're continuing to add to those, and I'm sure this session will help us identify some more. And more widely, we're keeping in touch with government and with sector bodies. We're able to provide insight from what we're getting and ensuring that there are clear communication channels there. So as some examples of the sort of key messages we're giving out in and answers to some of the questions that are coming up, and the way that we're sort of modifying regulation to make life easier, to get regulation out of the way where we can. Here are some examples which you'll see on the on our website. So, for example, one of the most immediate questions, some of the most immediate questions we got were, well, our filing deadline is at the end of March. We're going to miss it. What can we do? Can we have an extension? So yes, it is possible to apply for an extension, and you'll see on our website that you just need to drop an email to filingextensions@charitycommission.gov.uk for us to consider that. There were also questions about meetings, two main questions. One was about AGMs, can charities postpone them? Sometimes there are quite strong deadlines, hard deadlines imposed on charities by their governing documents. We have given advice on our website that says if you absolutely can't hold your website within the required time scale, we will understand that, and you just need to make a note of your decision to postpone and then go ahead when you can. There were also questions, quite obviously, about the practicality of holding meetings at all. So face-to-face meetings, to all intents and purposes, cannot be held. And there was some confusion, I think, about whether virtual meetings were a valid alternative. Well, in our guidance already, we made clear that video conferencing is fine. The definition of a meeting is that you need to be able to see and hear each other. So if you're able to set up something like the facility we've got at the moment, that is great. But we know that for a lot of charities, actually being able to see and hear people is not an option, and so the phone is needed. In usual times, a phone meeting, unless you've got a specific permission in your governing document, it would not be something that you can do. But we've made clear on our website that, clearly in these circumstances, needs must. And if the only option you have is to hold a telephone meeting, again, you need to note the decision and the reasons for doing that, which are pretty obvious, and go ahead on that basis. Other elements of our guidance cover things like providing reassurance to charities who, even in these emergency times, aren't entirely confident about whether or not they can use reserves. If you're a charity that does have reserves, now is indeed a time to dip into them. Other charities aren't quite clear about whether their objects allow them to help out with COVID-19 related issues, and we've given advice on our website about exploring to the full extent actually whether your objects do allow you to do that, even if they don't explicitly seem to. But if you do need to change them, then there are ways of doing that, and we've reminded people about that. So those are some examples of the questions that are coming up, the flexibility that we're trying to give to reassure charities and to make the framework as flexible as possible. I would just close with a couple of things. So one is we are reminding charities, however, that the risks do, there are some increased risks more generally beyond financial resilience and survivability. So, for example, around safeguarding, a lot of volunteers are being taken on, which is fantastic to see, and people are coming to help. But there are safeguarding issues there, and we've put a reminder in about the importance of that. We've also put out a statement with the fundraising regulator about safer giving, particularly pointing people towards the National Emergencies Trust and promoting giving to registered charities. So just to finish, we have made visible on our website our helpline number. If you need to write to us, if you look on our homepage, there's the inquiry form that you can use for that, and I've given you the email address for filing extensions. So to conclude, I know that your focus is going to be on responding to this really extreme crisis that we're all facing, and I hope you understand that from the Charity Commission's point of view, we want to make sure that regulation does support you, but that it does not get in your way. Thank you very much, and I'm sure you have questions which I think will be routed through Neil.
Adrian, not Neil, but we only met earlier on today. So that's...
Beg your pardon. Beg your pardon, Neil.
That's fine. Thank you, Nick, and thank you to both speakers so far for being so wonderfully punctual. So I will now hand over to Richard Kennell, who I think is sharing a computer with James Plunkett. So James Plunkett is a name that comes up, but I can promise you it is Richard Kennell who'll be speaking. So over to you, Richard.
Hi. I think most people on the call will have heard me talk about our response to the crisis previously, but just to update you on where we are and then a few points around funding particularly. We have continued to provide chilled, frozen and ambient food to the charity sector across Oxfordshire and wider that we were doing prior to the crisis. We've seen about 20% of those organisations drop off because they're closed and can't continue to provide food to their beneficiaries. But about 120 are continuing to take food, and we're trying to provide as much as they need. We have ramped up massively our community larder model, which effectively now is a box scheme into hubs around the county. We currently have 22 larder operations running in Oxfordshire. A large number in the city in partnership with the Oxford Hub and the City Council, a couple with CAB, particularly in Charwell in the west, and with other partners around the county. And that's providing a total of 3,000 non-perishable boxes and fruit and vegetables, 3,000 boxes a week at the moment across Oxfordshire, and increasing all of the time. And also this week, as a result of the Food Bank Forum earlier in the week, we are now providing stock into a number of food banks where we previously weren't working closely with food banks, and trying to augment their supply to their client group as well. All of that inevitably comes at a cost, and I think we're probably operating at 4 times the speed and 4 times the pace that we were working at 3 weeks ago. The additional costs to us the additional cost to us is approximately £50,000 a month. £15,000 a month of that is additional expenditure. And just to give you a picture on that, we've taken on more vans, we're obviously incurring more fuel costs, we've spent £5,000 on cardboard boxes to put the food into. In addition to that, the supply of food into us is rocketing exponentially. And today I've just taken on an additional warehouse unit on the same site as us to cope with the increase in supply of food, so that we can get as much of that out again as quickly as we possibly can. So there are additional costs in that. And then as Nick alluded to a moment ago, there's a huge loss in revenue because we've made all of our services free for the foreseeable future, where some of those services were previously charged for and traded. So huge upsurge in the amount of food that's coming in and going out, a new model, and that there are some costs associated with that. I just wanted to clarify one thing on our food response. So we think we are providing food predominantly to the vulnerable, disadvantaged, and those that are struggling, not just as a result of the crisis, but especially as a result of the crisis. It is not our intention to overlap with the government scheme to provide food to the 1.5 million people who are being shielded. There will inevitably be some overlap, but we are seeing ourselves as a tier beyond that, helping people that are struggling with food more generally. And that's pretty much it.
Great. Thank you, Richard. Now, there were a couple of people saying that they didn't catch. Do you want to just say again your name and the organisation you work for, you represent?
Me?
A couple of people missed it, yes.
Okay, so I'm Richard Cannell. I'm the CEO of Sophia, which is providing food parcels across the county. What I did miss out there, which I should say, is that the increased costs and the lost revenue, we have been getting quite a lot of funding support to cover some of those costs. I'm particularly pleased and thank you to Jane, because OCF responded really quickly to provide some funding to cover that gap, which is tremendously helpful. I think we will see the issue of funding further down the line when we're doing this in 2-3 months' time.
And lots of great kudos in the chat box, and also someone asking, is there a food hub in the Wantage area?
So we're running our community larder from, the nearest one would be Didcot. There's one in South Abingdon as well. But one of the things that we've done this week is started to link with other provision, so community fridges and food banks. And we provided some food to the Mix in Wantage yesterday, and we'll continue to do that on a weekly basis and keep talking to them. If their demand is increasing, we can help supply into them.
Great, thank you. Jane, do you want to come back on the phase 1, phase 2 question? There was a couple of people asking about that. And in the meantime, if others have got questions they want to post in the chat box for Richard, Jane, or from for the Charity Commission, then please do so. But Jane.
Yeah, I saw some questions around what was the timing around the phases, and I suggested that it's more about our approach to the decision making, that when we're looking at the applications that we see, if we think very much of phase 1 as about, are we enabling organisations to be able to respond better in the current crisis, in the way that Richard so ably described, how they've had to sort of shift what they're doing, change their model from having a membership paid for larder to make it free. So that's enabling them to be able to respond better and reach more and more larders around the county. And phase 2 is more about recovering stronger. So this is the point that I think Nick was really talking to, that for the Charities Commission in particular, we do want the sector to survive all of this. And it's absolutely critical that we work on some of the current issues, which are going to be around loss of income, cash flow challenges. And so that's what we're meaning there by recovering stronger. So one application for both phases. We're not phasing them in terms of our decision making, but it's just for us, so that we can be slightly more strategic about when we distribute money. We don't want it all to go on the emergent relief, but obviously we're very conscious that that is absolutely critical at the moment.
Thank you. And Jane, further questions on whether there's an indicative value that can be applied for with the OCF funding?
I think initially what the thing here is that we will be accepting repeat applications. But I think initially we're working on around £1,000 to £10,000 in terms of the grants that we'll award. The key thing that I perhaps didn't mention is that the way that the fund has been established is there are multiple funders actually that are supporting the pot of money that we have to give available. And so different funders have slightly different criteria, but that's something that we're going to be doing internally, so you don't need to worry about that. I think Nick from the Charity Commission did mention that the National Emergencies Trust are running a coronavirus appeal nationally, and they have partnered with community foundations, the 46 community foundations across the country, and will be distributing funds through us and obviously into Oxfordshire. So all of these have slightly different criteria, but how we've described our phases is very much the approach that the funders are all taking. Obviously looking at emergency relief and organisations working in that way, but also making sure that the sector survives, which is absolutely critical.
Thank you. And we've got lots of questions coming through, and if we don't get to them, we will find a way of responding after the meeting. Going back to, I think probably to Nick at the Charity Commission, we've got a question about liability cover for volunteers. One of the things we're trying to do in Oxfordshire is make volunteers available to whichever organisation needs them, so that they can fulfil local needs, whoever they've come from. Now, there is an issue of whose liability cover is covering that volunteer then, and we don't obviously want to have to register volunteers with every organisation. I don't know, Nick, if that's something you can speak to, or Jane, if you have anything to say on that question.
It's not something that we give advice on, I'm afraid. Is it something that you have expertise on, Jane?
I'm just sorry, as I'm muting myself. I think this is where we might want to defer to some of our volunteer experts. But is the question more around the liability insurance? Because I guess it's about the DBS. Is that right? That then they're not going to apply across organisations? I think is the question come from Pat in Banbury. Is that right?
Yes.
So I think that might just be something that we will go back to Pat and find out exactly what the challenge is that she's describing there. Yeah.
Okay. And someone was asking about you mentioned the impact of children, COVID-19 impact on children, and asking you to say a bit more about this.
Yeah, I think this is something that we've seen from other parts of the world, perhaps, that there have seen increases in domestic violence. Obviously, we know that children are often witnesses to that. So we're particularly concerned about children and the sort of adverse childhood experiences that they might have in this situation where obviously people are more confined in at home and obviously living in difficult circumstances.
Okay, and another question on furlough staff. Can the fund be used to retain staff who would otherwise have to be furloughed if they're delivering important frontline services?
I guess here the challenge is furlough is for staff that are no longer able to work in the organisation. So I guess there is a difference between if you need staff to deliver frontline services, then you wouldn't be wanting to furlough them. But I think this is a particular area that we'll be looking at in terms of advice. So one of the things that we mentioned was the ability to bring out more and more advice. So as I mentioned at the beginning, there isn't a lot of guidelines on furlough in particular at the moment, but obviously what we wouldn't want the fund to do would be to, I guess, award monies where there are alternative opportunities for the organisation to obtain cash. And if the government scheme was appropriate, then it would probably be more appropriate than the Resilient Fund, because we do imagine that's going to be quite a big chunk of money.
Thank you. We've had another question about whether step change funding has been diverted into the Resilience Fund.
Not as I speak. We're obviously always talking to all of our funders, as I mentioned at the beginning. But at the moment there are no step change funds in the Resilience Fund.
Great. And then a question about who will be making the decisions about where and at what pace to allocate the funds, which, although substantial, will risk disappearing very quickly.
Yeah, so we have obviously we do this all the time. The only thing that we don't do is normally at this speed. So all of our due diligence and our approval process has sort of been involved in this, and we will be having a small panel of our trustees and some assessors that will be making decisions on the applications. But obviously the ability, as I said earlier, about working with other partners and collaboratives like the Oxford Homeless Movement to enhance that decision making is also what we'll be wanting to do. Okay.
We've got a question about direct payments for people with learning disabilities. I don't think that's an area of expertise for any of our speakers, but we can look into that and find the right person to respond. If there's anyone, I think there is a hand raise option. So if anyone thinks they can answer that question, unmute yourself and shout now. Any more questions? If you have one, I think there's no more coming up in the chat box. So if you do have one you want to unmute and ask. Paul, you've just posted a very long comment. Do you want to, Paul Brivio, do you want to unmute yourself and just say what you've said in the chat box? Because I think people might be quite interested.
Yes, thanks, Adrian. We had information yesterday from Sport England, with whom we have a very close relationship. They fund us hugely, and they're being very helpful, I think, around trying to provide support to our sector. Now, I think our sector is sports clubs, but it's wider than that. So I'm hoping that a number of the agencies that we work with who are sitting in on this call may be able to benefit, not just from this emergency fund, but also to a bigger fund that's coming down the line very shortly around innovation and best practice, around keeping people active, but also getting more people active. So we'll provide some information through Oxfordshire All In tomorrow. We'll obviously work closely with Jane and her colleagues, because that's a great start, just to make sure that people aren't just chasing the money and we can steer them in the right direction wherever possible. So it's a large chunk of money from the look of things, but obviously there'll be an open application process. So we'll try and provide some support and help through Oxfordshire All In and through a contact number that we'll provide as soon as we can, hopefully tomorrow or Friday. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Danny, you've got your hand up, and then we've got several questions popping up in the chat box as well. But Danny, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, I just raised my hand about the direct payment question. I don't necessarily have the answer, but I could find out. But what I do have is some really helpful information pack stuff from a colleague in another local authority, because of course we're all desperately reaching out to each other as well, trying to pull together best practice, just like everyone else is across different sectors. So I've got some stuff I can probably share from Hammersmith and Fulham. They've put some really nice work together, but I can try and get in touch with the social care commissioner who would be able to answer any questions about direct payments. Thank you, Danny. That would be really helpful.
And back to Jane. What collaboration will there be with OCVA and Community First Oxfordshire in terms of allocation of the grants?
Right, so I've just actually posted a note in the chat box there saying that obviously many people on this group are actually meeting regularly within the Oxfordshire All-In forum, and both OCVA and CFO are party to that too. And earlier in the week we did send out something suggesting that this is a really good way for organisations to share their needs and what they're finding. So that will be a very big resource, and where we'll be working in partnership to inform and improve the insight and intelligence that we have about where the needs are in the county. So that's absolutely a critical thing that we see. And it's all open data. So one of the things I think the team were thinking of is that if groups are actually putting out what their needs are and they make an application, there should be a way for us to bring some of that data back in from Oxfordshire All In, because it is open data and can easily be sourced, so that we don't have to keep asking all the same questions. So that's partly why we're trying to work in partnership with others.
Thank you. And a few questions about when the information is going live. It is now on the Oxfordshire Community Foundation website, I understand, along with details of other funding opportunities that, as they come through, will be posted there. So do check out the website if you haven't already. I'm just going through the comments. OCC, is that Youth Opportunities Fund monies, are they still going to be released? I don't know if anyone from OCC is able to answer that, or anyone else. In terms of how we'll feed back, we will be looking to share information. We won't have emails for everyone on the call. I don't think that we get that as part of Zoom, but obviously people have heard through mailing lists, and we will be mailing back out to those lists with update and information. And as Jane said earlier, we're hoping to have these sessions on a weekly basis anyway. So bear with us while we work out the best kind of communication pathways, but we do intend to be very open and transparent with communications with you. Data gathering. Sorry, Danny, the question about OCC is YOF monies, which I think is probably Youth Opportunities Fund, but I'm not sure. Are they still going to be released, or will they be withheld?
Again, I don't have the answer, but I can definitely try and find out for you. What's the best way for me to kind of feed that back into this group? Are we all on Slack?
I mean, we've got 100 people on this call, so they're not all on Slack. If you feed it back to Oxfordshire Community Foundation and me, we will make sure it goes into whatever briefing comes out after this meeting.
Okay, so I'm asking about the, what was it again, sorry?
The YOF, if someone
YOF,
wants to, yeah.
Cool.
And I think I know the answer to this, but has anyone started a data gathering activity as to what the income gap is for the third sector in Oxfordshire? NCVO were talking about 4 billion yesterday. I think we're doing some initial mapping work, asking people about what the risks and what the challenges are, and funding is obviously coming up. But I'm not aware of anyone trying to put a number on that for Oxfordshire at the moment. Right. We have about 5 minutes left. If anyone has any further questions or
it's Brian from Train, Adrian. Could I ask a question?
Yes, please do, Brian.
I posted the question about, is OCC going to release YOF monies? And Jane, this links to the question that was asked earlier about furloughing, because when you're looking at your overall resource capacity, you're looking at the whole. And for instance, so in the YOF, we won monies to run 2 years worth of monies to run a youth club in Didcot. And so we identified who from the resources would actually do that work, the planning and the carrying out of that work. EIYF monies made available last year haven't been replaced, but part of our decision making about retaining resource that was recruited for that was, you know, other grants that we thought were coming in, one of which is YOF. So that furloughing question is a very valid question, because it was part of, you know, people were making decisions based on the whole, and the whole's made up of some sort of significant parts. So that is, I think that is a fair question to ask. It's one that we're working on at this point in time as we switch all of our activities to digital from face to face.
Yeah, and we anticipate that digital is going to play a big part in the response. So I think it is a valid question.
Okay, thanks, Jane. I just wanted to open it out just to see that sort of like that bigger picture.
Yeah.
Someone suggested that the question on the funding shortfall might be a good one for Oxford University students. We are, Oxfordshire All In, Rue, who's been leading the coordination work there, was trying to join the call, but unfortunately was slightly late, and so because we hit the 100 limit, I'm not sure he managed to get in. But they have got an amazing tech team. If you've seen the Oxfordshire All In website, all of the mapping work that's going on behind that and all the back end behind that has been done by that team. And I'll talk to Rue after this meeting and see what the easiest way will be to try and get an estimation of the financial shortfall that we're looking at across the voluntary and community sector in Oxfordshire, because I think it'd be a really important question to answer. So yeah, so someone else is saying Keane and Rue are good people to include on
Definitely.
that. Anybody else with any final comments or questions? Lucy Waring, you've got your hand up. I'll unmute you.
Hiya. Yeah, I just actually want to return to the same point that's been brought up by ArcT and the chat before me, of just to really make clear, I think, the position that lots of us are in, as in having to choose whether to join the kind of community response with our staff and do everything we probably want to do as charities and social businesses, or to furlough our staff. And the advice that certainly we've had from Co-ops UK or from other kind of resources for charities is that if you furlough staff, then, you know, HMRC will be auditing you. That can be quite scary, that can be quite intimidating, that can be quite thorough, and that your staff should be well and truly furloughed, which as community organisers is a bit of a scary, is a bit of a scary prospect, because it means that you're suddenly, you know, you've lost your ability to join in the community response in a way that you probably wanted to, in a way that your staff probably wanted to. And so I just want to make that even more explicit, and just kind of ask, like, within this fund, I totally understand that it's probably not within the capacity of this fund to replace that 80% that would come from the government's job retention scheme, but will the fund consider applications, maybe more kind of creative ideas from consortia of different community organisations or charities that would look at creative ways of addressing that kind of that binary decision?
I think that comes back to the emerging needs, doesn't it, Lucy? That if you can see an opportunity to redeploy staff or resources to actually deliver a need that's been identified that perhaps wasn't there before, then I think that would be definitely an opportunity to look at the respond better. How are we able to meet more of these needs? So we are very well aware that there are people in the sector with expertise and experience and the right mindset that need to be supported into doing the things that need to be done in very much the way that Richard described earlier.
Thank you. And questions come up. Can we put an application in to send burnt out charity CEOs after this is over? I think that's not just
we
CEO,
can ask Mott. Why don't we ask Mr. Mott? Nick, what do you think of that?
Yeah, a definite charitable purpose there, I think, no problem.
I think charities should go on retreat altogether to reward themselves after this is over, along with, you know, large swathes of the NHS and, you know, grocery deliveries and all sorts of other people. We are at time. Thank you very much, Nick, for making the time to be with us today in Oxfordshire. It's been really, really useful to have your inputs. Thank you, Jane, for the work you're doing and the funding you're making available at high speed. And thank you, Richard, and echoing the comments in the chat box about the great work that Sophia are doing to get food out to people who need it. If you have more questions, my email was at the top. You know OCF's contact details. Please get in touch. We want this to be a long, live, open conversation, and we hope to see many of you back here again in a week's time. Thank you, everybody. Jane, any final words? Nick?
Yeah, just a word. I think obviously as we did sort of reach 100, which is a fantastic achievement with very little time to even know that the meeting was going ahead. If you are aware of others that did want to come on, obviously there will be a recording, but there are other platforms we could use. So let's make sure that we can invite more if necessary. But thank you.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate
Thank you all.
your time, everybody. Good enough.